Rain falls softly on the narrow streets of Palermo, each droplet glistening beneath the dim orange light of a flickering lamp. The night smells of wet stone, old tobacco, and secrets, the kind that never reach daylight. Somewhere deep within these alleys, among shuttered cafes and silent doorways, a name drifts through the air like smoke. Enzo. The whisper. No one says it loudly. In this city, names like his are not spoken, they are breathed, almost feared, as if sound itself could summon him. Those who knew him, or claimed they did, could never quite describe his face. Some said he was tall, others swore he was short. One man insisted he had gray eyes like a winter sea, another said they were dark and cold as oil. The truth was simpler, no one had ever looked at him long enough to remember. Enzo had a way of vanishing even when he was standing in front of you. A movement in a corner of vision, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, and then, nothing. Silence. That was his signature. The silence after a job done so perfectly, it was as if death itself had whispered rather than screamed. In the underworld of 1970s Sicily, where loyalty was currency and betrayal came with a bullet, the whisper was a ghost story told by criminals to other criminals. He wasn't a boss or a soldier or even a man, some said, just a rumor that crept between families when someone important turned up dead. They said he could appear in a crowded street without being seen, that he could walk through a guarded door without a sound, and that he left no traces behind, no footprints, no shells, no fingerprints. Even the police reports, buried in dusty drawers, were blank after the section labeled "Suspect." Just a question mark. Yet there was something different about Enzo's killings. They weren't messy or cruel. There were no signs of struggle, no unnecessary violence. Victims were often found sitting, as though they'd simply fallen asleep. That precision, that calm, it unnerved even the hardest men in the mafia. Killing was supposed to be loud, fast, chaotic. But the whisper's way was gentle, methodical, almost reverent. It was said that before he struck, he murmured a few quiet words, a prayer, a farewell, or perhaps an apology. No one could agree on what he whispered, but those who claimed to have heard it said it was the last sound they remembered before everything went dark. There are stories that he wasn't born a killer, that once he had been just a boy selling fish near the Palermo docks. But something happened, something terrible, that broke whatever fragile light he had inside. From that moment on, he spoke less, moved less, existed quietly between worlds. The streets shaped him. The mafia found him. And from silence, he learned power. Tonight, in a dim tavern on Via Vittorio Emanuele, two old men speak about him over a bottle of red wine. Their voices tremble, though the room is warm. You know what they say, one mutters. He never missed. Not once. The other shakes his head. I heard he disappeared, went north, maybe to France. Or maybe he's dead already. They pause, both looking toward the doorway as the wind pushes it open slightly. The sound it makes, a low, creaking sigh, feels almost like a whisper. They exchange uneasy glances and pour another glass. No one finishes their drink. Outside, the rain has stopped. The streets glisten with the reflection of broken lights and a moon hidden behind clouds. A man in a dark coat passes through the Piazza Marina, his steps slow and measured. He wears gloves, a hat pulled low. No one notices him. A stray cat darts into the shadows, startled by the sudden stillness in the air. He stops near a parked car, looks once over his shoulder, and disappears into an alley that seems to swallow him whole. For a moment, only the faintest echo remains, a whisper, carried by the wind, blending with the distant sound of church bells. If you were there, you might have missed it. Most people would. Because the whisper was not made to be seen or heard. He was made to be felt, a tension in the chest, a sudden chill at the back of the neck, a pause between one heartbeat and the next. The city itself seemed to know when he was near. Dogs went quiet. Doors stayed closed. Even the sea, restless and eternal, calmed when he walked the coast. Those who dealt in death began to fear their own trade, for they knew that one day, in some quiet corner, they too might hear a breath behind them and realize their story had reached its end. But who was Enzo, truly? A man? A ghost? A reflection of guilt? In the years that followed, investigators and journalists would chase his legend across countries and continents. Files were opened, witnesses interviewed, photographs studied. Nothing. It was as if he existed only in the spaces between certainty, in the unspoken parts of history. And maybe that was his intention. Maybe the Whisper never wanted to be remembered at all. Yet, every few years, a new story surfaces, a body found in the same fashion, a camera catching a blur of motion that resembles no one known. A pattern repeating, faint but unmistakable. Some believe it's a copycat, others say it's impossible. But those who lived through the old days, those who once shared his world, they shake their heads and smile a little sadly. No, they say, that's him. The Whisper doesn't die. He just changes places. And somewhere, perhaps far from Palermo, perhaps not, a man sits alone in a small, dim room. The walls are bare, the air still. On the table in front of him rests a single photograph, a blurred image of a face half hidden in shadow. His hands are steady as he traces the outline with his thumb. Outside, the night begins to hum again, soft, endless, familiar. He leans back, closes his eyes, and for the first time in years, he speaks aloud, his voice so low it could be mistaken for the sound of the wind. They still remember, he says quietly, almost to himself. Even when they don't want to. And then, like every story about Enzo, the Whisper, the sound fades, the lights dim, and all that remains is silence. The sun over Palermo rises differently than anywhere else. It creeps, slow and reluctant, over the uneven rooftops, washing the narrow alleys in a pale amber glow that feels older than time itself. Morning here is never quiet. The city wakes with the sound of distant church bells, fishermen shouting down by the port, and the low hum of markets already alive with barter and gossip. Somewhere among that chorus of life, in a forgotten corner of the seaside district, a boy named Enzo learned the language of silence. He lived in a small stone house that always smelled faintly of saltwater and smoke. His mother, Rosa, worked herself to exhaustion mending nets for the fishermen who barely paid her, while his father, Carlo, was a man of few words and heavy debts. The mafia's presence in those days wasn't spoken of openly, but it was everywhere, in the way men lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned, in how the baker's son suddenly had new shoes after his father did a favor, and in the way fear hung in the air like humidity. To a child, it all felt normal. To Enzo, it was the rhythm of life. He was a quiet boy from the beginning, not shy, just observant. He noticed everything, the cracks in the walls, the way his mother's hands trembled after someone knocked at the door late at night, the way his father's smile tightened whenever men in black coats came to collect money. He learned early that talking often made things worse. So he listened instead. To footsteps. To tone. To silence. That was his gift, though no one saw it yet, the ability to read the spaces between sounds. Sometimes, when the sea was calm, he would sneak down to the docks and sit for hours, watching the fishermen return with their catch. The air smelled of brine and diesel, and the gulls screamed overhead, fighting for scraps. He liked the way the waves moved, steady and unhurried, as if they knew secrets the world had forgotten. When his father wasn't home, which was often, Enzo would stare at that endless horizon and imagine other places, cities where no one shouted, no one owed, and no one disappeared. But Palermo was not kind to dreamers. When he was 9, a group of boys from the neighborhood cornered him behind the church. They laughed, called him Ghost Boy, pushed him into the dirt because he never spoke back. One of them, the butcher's son, tried to take his small wooden cross, his mother's gift. Enzo's reaction was swift, instinctive, frightening. He moved without thinking, grabbing a piece of broken glass from the ground, slicing the air just enough to make them step back. His expression never changed. He didn't yell or threaten. He just looked at them with eyes that didn't blink. They never touched him again. That same year, his father's debts came due. Men in long coats came one evening when the wind was high and the sea roared against the rocks. They spoke softly at first, then louder. Enzo hid under the table, hearing every word. "You had time, Carlo," one said, his voice smooth, almost polite. "Now time is finished." His father tried to explain, to beg, to promise. Then there was a sudden thud, a cry, and the sound of water spilling across the floor, or maybe blood. Enzo's mother screamed. When he crawled out moments later, the room was empty. His father was gone. The door swung open, letting in the cold night air. The boy would never see him again. After that night, something in him closed forever. His mother stopped talking about the future. She lit a candle each evening and whispered prayers, her lips moving soundlessly. Enzo stopped going to school. He spent his days wandering the backstreets, selling small bags of salt or running errands for the market men. He saw too much for his age: beatings in alleys, police turning their backs, women crying quietly behind shutters. Yet through it all, he rarely spoke. Silence had become his protection, a thin layer between him and a world that no longer made sense. There was one person who saw the depth behind those quiet eyes, old Nonno Pietro, the retired dockhand who spent his days mending nets near the port. He would sometimes share his bread with the boy and tell stories of the old Sicily, of kings and saints, pirates and storms. "You listen well, ragazzo," Pietro would say, squinting against the sun. "That's a rare gift. Most people only wait for their turn to speak." Enzo didn't reply, but he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that flickered like a candle before vanishing. Pietro would pat his shoulder. "Remember this, little one, silence is a shield, but too much of it can turn into a prison." Those words stayed with him long after the old man's death. They echoed in his mind during lonely nights when he stared out the window, listening to the faraway sounds of laughter and sirens. He wondered if his father was alive somewhere. He wondered if the men in coats still remembered his family's name. And he wondered why his mother always looked over her shoulder when walking through the market, as if ghosts followed her. By the time Enzo turned 13, Palermo had begun to change. The city grew noisier, hungrier, more desperate. The streets filled with foreign cars, new faces, new rules. The mafia's grip tightened, businesses paid for protection, and those who didn't simply vanished. One night, Enzo followed two strangers who came to collect money from the fishmonger. He kept his distance, hidden behind crates. He watched as the taller man smiled kindly before shoving the fishmonger's head into a bucket of ice water. The smaller one took cash from the register, then wiped the counter clean. They left no trace, no noise. Enzo stood frozen, watching the steam of their breath in the cold air. The smaller man glanced back once, as if sensing eyes on him, but Enzo didn't move. In that frozen moment, something like understanding took root. Violence didn't need to roar, it could whisper. That realization marked the end of his childhood. His mother, weakened by illness and sorrow, died before he turned 15. Her last words to him were faint, almost lost to the wind. "Don't follow the silence too far, Enzo," she murmured. "It will swallow you." But by then, the boy she loved was already halfway gone. After her funeral, he stood at the edge of the sea, the salt air sharp on his tongue. The sky was gray, the horizon endless. Somewhere behind him, life in the city went on, voices, wheels, dogs barking. But in front of him was only the slow, rhythmic pulse of the tide. He watched it for hours, motionless, until the first stars appeared. When he finally turned away, his face was calm, expressionless, older than his years. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply walked into the dark, a boy with no family, no future, and a silence so deep it almost seemed alive. The streets would soon give him purpose. The whispers of men in the backrooms of cafes would soon find their way to his ears. They would see something in him, discipline, detachment, the absence of fear, and they would shape it into something deadly. But that was later. For now, he was still just a shadow among many, a quiet boy from the docks who carried in his heart the soundless rhythm of loss. Palermo slept that night under a thin veil of fog. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. And in a small alley behind the market, Enzo sat with his back to the wall, watching the lantern light flicker on the wet stones. The world was changing around him, piece by piece, and though he couldn't yet name it, fate had already begun to whisper his name. The first time Enzo saw blood spill by his own hand, the world seemed to slow down, not in shock, but in eerie stillness. It was as if time itself paused to watch. He was 16 then, working odd jobs around the port, unloading crates, sweeping floors, delivering letters that weren't meant to be opened. He was still small, still quiet, still invisible. But in Palermo, invisibility could be a currency, and someone had noticed him. It happened on a humid afternoon at a cafe near Via Roma. Enzo was delivering a sealed envelope for one of the dock bosses when a black car pulled up. 3 men stepped out, well-dressed, heavy with purpose. They spoke briefly to the cafe owner, and then, without warning, one of them slapped the man across the face. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Enzo froze, envelope in hand. The men turned, their eyes sweeping the crowd until they landed on him. "You," one of them said. "Come here." His voice was calm, almost polite. Enzo obeyed. The man smiled faintly. "What's your name, ragazzo?" Enzo hesitated. "Enzo," he said quietly. "Good," the man replied. "You're going to deliver something else for us." They led him into the back room, a small, windowless space that smelled of coffee and gun oil. A man sat in a chair, hands tied, blood on his lip. "You know what happens to those who forget loyalty," the tall one said, glancing down at the prisoner. Then to Enzo, he added, "Watch carefully. You'll learn something." The boy didn't blink. He watched as the man in the chair begged in Sicilian, words tumbling too fast to understand. The tall man sighed, took out a knife, and pressed it gently to the man's throat, not cutting, just letting the cold metal rest there. "Silence," he whispered, and did the job cleanly, efficiently. When it was done, he turned back to Enzo. "You didn't look away," he said. "That's good." That was the beginning. Within days, Enzo was summoned again, first to deliver messages, then to follow men discreetly, and eventually, to stand watch during late-night meetings. He spoke little, asked nothing, and remembered everything. It wasn't long before word spread, the boy who never flinched. In the criminal world, that was a rare and valuable quality. His mentor, if the word could be used, was a mid-level enforcer named Rocco Bellini, a man with a crooked nose, a fondness for espresso, and a violent temper that he disguised behind charm. Rocco saw potential in Enzo. "You move quiet," he said one night as they sat by the harbor, watching lights shimmer on the water. "That's a gift. You don't fidget, don't talk too much. You'd make a good shadow." He handed Enzo a cigarette, though the boy didn't smoke. "You listen more than you speak. That's how men survive in this life." Rocco began teaching him the small details, how to read body language, how to walk unnoticed, how to recognize when someone was lying. "The loud ones die young," he said. "The quiet ones write history." Enzo absorbed every word. He practiced walking on uneven cobblestones without a sound, learned to breathe slowly when nervous, and discovered how to melt into a crowd until he ceased to exist. The first real test came one rainy night in a warehouse near the docks. A shipment had gone missing, stolen by a man who thought he could sell directly to a rival family. Rocco's crew was sent to deal with it. Enzo's job was simple, stand watch outside. But as the night unfolded, something went wrong. Shouts erupted inside, followed by gunfire. Then silence. The door burst open, and a wounded man staggered out, the traitor, bleeding but alive. He saw Enzo, panic flashing in his eyes, and charged toward him, knife in hand. Instinct took over. Enzo sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, and drove his own blade upward, not deep, just enough to stop him. The man gasped, eyes wide with shock, as if unable to believe the boy had done it. Enzo stepped back, letting him fall. The rain washed the blood into the cracks of the pavement. For a moment, the world held its breath. Enzo's heart was steady, his breathing calm. He felt nothing, no triumph, no guilt, just quiet. When Rocco emerged moments later and saw what had happened, he gave a low whistle. "You did that?" Enzo nodded once. Rocco smiled. "You're colder than you look, ragazzo. I like that." From that night forward, Enzo was no longer just a messenger. He became something else, a tool, precise and reliable. The older men began calling him Il Sussurro, the Whisper. The nickname began as a joke, but it stuck because it fit. He moved like smoke, spoke in few words, and seemed to appear exactly where he was needed. When someone betrayed the family, when someone needed to disappear quietly, Rocco would look across the room and say, "Send the Whisper." Each time, Enzo delivered. He studied his targets carefully, learned their habits, their routines. He approached only when certain, acted only once, and left no noise behind. The others began to fear him, even those on his side. There was something unsettling about the boy's calm, about the way he wiped his hands afterward as if cleaning dust rather than blood. But there were moments, rare, fleeting, when he still felt the weight of what he was becoming. Late at night, alone in his room, he'd stare at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The face staring back seemed older, harder. His eyes no longer held curiosity, only calculation. Sometimes he'd think of his mother, her gentle voice, her warning not to follow the silence too far. He'd push the thought away. In Palermo, sentiment was dangerous. Regret was death. One evening, Rocco brought him to meet someone important, Don Salvatore Marino, one of the city's most feared and respected figures. The meeting took place in a dimly lit villa on the outskirts, where the air smelled of citrus trees and gun oil. Marino was an older man, elegant, sharp-eyed, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "So this is the boy," he said, studying Enzo. "The one who doesn't speak." He leaned closer. "You understand loyalty?" Enzo nodded. "You understand fear?" Another nod. Marino's smile widened. "Good. You'll do." That night marked the end of Enzo's childhood. He had entered a new world, one of codes, rituals, and shadows. Under Marino's command, he would learn precision, patience, and the art of making death look like accident or fate. He would be shaped into something almost inhuman, not by cruelty, but by the careful, methodical discipline of men who believed silence was the purest form of power. As he walked home under the dim Sicilian moon, the streets empty and wet, Enzo felt the weight of that word echo in his mind, the Whisper. It didn't sound like a name. It sounded like a prophecy. And deep down, in the quiet corners of his heart, he already knew, there was no turning back. Years passed, and the boy who once swept the docks became a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones across Palermo. Enzo had grown into the role that destiny, or perhaps the city itself, had carved for him. He moved through the world like a shadow with purpose, unseen yet always present. To outsiders, he was a ghost, faceless, quiet, methodical. To those who knew better, he was something far more dangerous, a professional born not from impulse, but from precision. His methods had evolved, sharpened by experience, guided by men who believed that chaos was a tool only fools used without restraint. By his mid-twenties, Enzo was working directly under Don Marino, handling matters that required discretion rather than force. He became the invisible hand that cleaned the family's mistakes, an operative who understood that power didn't come from noise or blood, but from control. His reputation reached beyond Palermo, stretching quietly into Naples, Rome, and even across the sea to Marseille. The legend of Il Cicero grew, not because people saw him, but because they never did. There were whispers of how he could make a man vanish in broad daylight, how he never carried a gun but always left his mark, how he could walk through a crowd and leave only silence in his wake. But power, no matter how quiet, attracts attention. One evening, as Enzo stood in a narrow alley behind a crumbling church, Rocco approached him, older now, slower, his hair gray at the temples. He handed Enzo a small envelope. Inside was a name and a photograph. The target was an accountant, a thin, nervous man who had been selling information to the police. "Don Marino wants this handled," Rocco said softly. Enzo studied the photo without emotion, then looked up. "No noise?" he asked. Rocco nodded. "No noise." That night, Enzo followed the accountant through the dim streets of the old quarter. The man moved fast, constantly looking over his shoulder, clutching a worn briefcase as though it were his only lifeline. Rain had begun to fall, slow, steady, merciless. When the accountant ducked into a side street, Enzo followed, steps soundless against the cobblestones. He waited for the moment, the exact intersection between fear and inevitability. When the man finally turned around, breath ragged, eyes wide, Enzo stepped out of the shadows. "Please," the man stammered, "I didn't," the rest of the words dissolved in the rain. Enzo moved swiftly, efficiently. The briefcase hit the ground with a dull thud. The man's body followed soon after. It should have ended there. It always did. But as Enzo stood over the body, something unexpected caught his attention. The briefcase had burst open, papers spilling into the water. He knelt to gather them, more out of habit than curiosity, but when his eyes caught the printed words, he froze. The documents weren't financial records, they were coded correspondences, messages exchanged between Don Marino and a rival syndicate. Hidden payments, shared assets, mutual betrayals. The accountant hadn't been selling information to the police, he'd been trying to protect himself after discovering that Marino had been playing both sides. For the first time in years, Enzo hesitated. The air around him felt heavier, the rain colder. He folded the papers carefully and slipped them into his coat. He didn't know why, perhaps instinct, perhaps something deeper, but some part of him understood that he had just stumbled upon a truth that was meant to stay buried. Days turned into weeks, and the papers stayed hidden in the false bottom of his drawer. Enzo continued his work, silent and precise as always, but something inside him had shifted. He watched Marino more closely now, the way the Don smiled too easily, the way he spoke about loyalty while quietly eliminating those who had served him longest. The word family began to sound hollow. Rocco noticed the change. "You've been quiet," he said one night. Enzo almost smiled. "I've always been quiet." But Rocco shook his head. "Not like this. You're thinking too much. In our line of work, thinking gets you killed." He was right. Thinking was dangerous. But Enzo couldn't stop. He began to notice patterns, unexplained deaths, shipments disappearing, money moving through names that didn't exist. Marino wasn't just maintaining his empire, he was dismantling it piece by piece, preparing for something larger. Something hidden. And Enzo realized he was part of it, a disposable asset in a grander game. The realization didn't bring anger, only clarity. He had always been told that silence was power. But now he saw that silence was also a prison, one that Marino had built for him, brick by brick, kill by kill. The final crack came during a late-night meeting in the villa. Marino gathered his lieutenants, including Rocco and Enzo, around a long wooden table. "There's a traitor among us," he announced, his tone cold and theatrical. "Someone's been feeding information to the police. Enzo's pulse slowed. He recognized the tactic, the Don was cleaning house again. But when Marino's eyes landed on Rocco, Enzo understood what was about to happen. "You've been with me a long time, old friend," Marino said softly. "But loyalty fades with age." Before Rocco could speak, one of Marino's guards stepped forward, gun raised. The shot was quick, clean. Rocco slumped forward, the light gone from his eyes. Enzo didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the man who had once been his teacher, now dead at the feet of the man they both served. Marino looked at Enzo and smiled faintly. "I expect the same loyalty from you," he said. Rocco forgot his place. "You won't." Enzo met his gaze, calm as always. "No," he said quietly. "I won't." That night, when he returned home, Enzo took the hidden papers from his drawer and spread them out on the table. The rain outside drummed against the window, the same steady rhythm as the night he killed the accountant. He read every line again, understanding it all now, the corruption, the betrayals, the deaths that had been disguised as justice. Marino's empire wasn't built on loyalty or honor. It was built on deceit, layered with blood, and dressed in silence. And Enzo realized that he was the final piece, the last loose end. For the first time in his life, he felt something that wasn't duty or control. It was something unfamiliar, sharp, alive, defiance. The whisper had served the shadows for too long. Now, he decided, it was time to turn the silence against its masters. The hunter was about to become the ghost they feared. And in the stillness of that Sicilian night, as thunder rolled over the city, Enzo began to plan, not his next kill, but his escape. The streets of Palermo had grown quieter at night, but only in comparison to the chaos that thrived during the day. For Enzo, there was little comfort in familiarity anymore. The city, with its crumbling buildings, narrow alleys, and sea-salted air, had once been a playground of shadows. Now, it felt like a cage. His every movement, though silent, was tracked by unseen eyes, every alleyway he knew by heart seemed to whisper betrayal. It was time to leave, to cross borders not just of geography, but of memory, loyalty, and self-preservation. Rome beckoned like a distant storm, large, imposing, and full of opportunity. The journey itself was unremarkable to a casual observer. Enzo boarded a night train under an assumed name, blending seamlessly among the ordinary travelers, his coat pulled tight against the chill November wind. The train rattled through the hills, carrying him north, past vineyards and olive groves, past sleepy towns that had never heard his name. Yet inside him, the rhythm of Palermo never ceased. Every click of the wheels against the tracks mirrored the heartbeat of the city he left behind, a constant reminder that silence could only protect him so far. Each station passed like a heartbeat, the distance grew, but so did the awareness that leaving didn't erase the past, it only gave him new terrain to navigate. Rome greeted him with a heat different from Sicily's salt-tinged breeze. The city was alive with light and shadows, a maze of narrow streets, towering churches, and hidden corners. It was more than a city, it was a living organism that demanded caution and respect. Enzo, carrying only a small bag and the weight of his reputation, quickly understood that the rules here were subtly different. The mafia was no longer a local code but a complex network of alliances, betrayals, and whispered threats stretching across the country. Here, he would serve as a ghost courier, an intermediary in delicate matters that required invisibility and discretion. The first assignment came unexpectedly. A prominent Roman businessman had become entangled with the wrong people, and Enzo was tasked with ensuring a certain ledger, a book of debts and payments, disappeared without a trace. It was not a violent mission, but it demanded the same precision he had learned in Palermo: observation, patience, timing. He followed the target for days, learning routines, habits, and the exact moment when the man would be alone. At night, he would find a quiet cafe or a deserted bench, watching through fogged windows, noting every movement, every breath, every tiny lapse in attention. The city itself seemed to pause for him, allowing him to weave through crowds unnoticed, a shadow among many. Soon, the work escalated. Enzo's reputation preceded him even here. Roman crime families whispered his name like a cautionary tale, never seeing him, only feeling the consequences of his actions. Letters disappeared, evidence was misplaced, enemies quietly disappeared, all without a sound. Yet, even in this relative anonymity, he felt a gnawing tension. In Palermo, he had known the rhythm of the streets; here, the rules were more subtle, more dangerous. Every misstep could draw attention from those who did not forgive, who did not forget. He became obsessed with observation, the slight change in a man's gait, the way a guard tilted his head, the shadows cast by a flickering street lamp. Rome required not just invisibility but intelligence, the art of knowing without revealing oneself. Evenings were the hardest. Alone in rented rooms above cramped shops, he would watch the city settle under lamplight, listening to the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout, the faint tolling of bells. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine Palermo's sea, its rough waves and soft breeze, the docks still alive with voices that were long gone. There was a dreamlike quality to the nights, a hypnotic rhythm that allowed him to reflect without risk. He was a man between worlds, part shadow, part observer, entirely unseen. During this time, he met others in similar trades, silent operatives, men and women who moved through Rome like ghosts, each with their own code, each with their own history of quiet violence. They exchanged no words about their pasts, no smiles of camaraderie. But in their presence, Enzo felt a strange kinship. They were people who existed only in the space between what was done and what could be remembered. Together, they became an unspoken network, each aware of the other's capabilities, each reliant on discretion above all else. Rome, with its ancient streets and modern corruption, had become both classroom and proving ground. One particular assignment highlighted the duality of his existence, a clandestine meeting in the catacombs beneath the city. Here, the centuries-old tunnels echoed with the whispers of history, their stone walls dripping with moisture, and every step could betray a presence. Enzo had to deliver a message to a high-ranking syndicate member. A job that could have ended in gunfire or exposure if not executed perfectly. Moving through the labyrinth, he relied on every lesson from Palermo: observation, timing, patience, and silence. The message was delivered. The meeting concluded without incident. To an outsider, nothing had happened. To those who knew, it had been a demonstration of the rarest kind of skill, a phantom moving among men who would have killed without hesitation. Despite the successes, there were moments of profound solitude. Rome's grandeur could not replace the intimacy of the sea air in Palermo, the smell of the docks, the narrow alleys where one could disappear completely. Yet these absences sharpened his senses. He became attuned to rhythm, to light and shadow, to patterns invisible to most. Every assignment honed him further, molding his abilities into tools that were nearly surgical. Enzo's work became not just survival but artistry, the choreography of shadows and sound, where a single misstep could mean death for him or someone else. By the time the first winter in Rome arrived, Enzo had earned the unspoken respect of those who mattered. He was no longer the boy who had walked Palermo's alleys, he was a man who understood the psychology of silence, the power of observation, and the quiet terror of inevitability. His assignments grew more sensitive, more dangerous, and sometimes more morally ambiguous. Occasionally, he would question the orders, the people involved, the morality of the acts he carried out. Yet questioning could be fatal, so he buried these thoughts, letting them settle like dust in the corners of his mind. And so, the city moved around him, unaware of the ghost it harbored. Men who believed they were in control did not notice him stepping past, gliding unseen, a shadow among shadows. Letters vanished, deals collapsed, lives changed without warning, all orchestrated by a man whose face remained unknown, whose voice remained unheard, and whose presence was felt only in the absence it left behind. Rome became the proving ground for Enzo, the city that expanded his legend, deepened his skills, and prepared him for the inevitable confrontations that lay ahead, confrontations that would challenge not only his abilities but his very understanding of loyalty, power, and silence. Night after night, after completing his work, Enzo would stand on a terrace overlooking the Tiber, the city lights shimmering on its water like countless tiny stars. He would breathe deeply, letting the scents of smoke, wet stone, and distant gardens fill his lungs. Here, he could almost imagine the waves of Palermo, hear the gulls cry above the harbor, smell the brine in the air. Yet even in these quiet moments, he felt the weight of his path. Each step in Rome was a step further from home, further from innocence, further from the boy who once had no name, only silence. And yet, he also understood that this city, with its light and shadow, had given him something Palermo never could, mastery. Mastery over the unseen, over fear, and over the delicate, deadly art that would define him for the rest of his life. The years in Rome shaped Enzo in ways that Palermo never could. In the beginning, he had moved quietly, following orders and disappearing into shadows, mastering the craft of observation and discretion. But over time, the city's labyrinthine streets, its ancient ruins, and the ever-present undercurrent of power struggles began to teach him a lesson far more subtle and dangerous. In this life, it was not only skill that kept a man alive, but perception, the ability to read intentions before they were even spoken, to sense betrayal before it took shape, and to move like smoke through a world that expected him to stumble. Enzo's work had become more complex. No longer was he simply an observer or a courier of messages, he was being called upon to orchestrate situations, to manipulate outcomes with the precision of a chess master moving pieces in a silent game. A ledger lost here, a missing payment there, and already a ripple of fear would spread through families who believed themselves untouchable. To outsiders, these events were accidents, coincidences, or misfortune. But to those who watched closely, the hand of Il Cicero could be traced, not in bold strokes, but in the delicate absence of evidence, the quiet orchestration that left men trembling with unease, unsure if they had been played or merely unlucky. It was during this period that Enzo began cultivating his network, quiet allies who worked in shadows, experts who spoke only when necessary, each bound by the same unwritten code, discretion above all else. He learned to assess loyalty not by promises, but by observing behavior, the subtle twitch of a hand, the hesitation before a word, the way someone carried themselves when the light of scrutiny fell upon them. Trust was scarce, and betrayal was common. Yet in cultivating these connections, Enzo became more than an assassin, he became a strategist, a man capable of controlling outcomes without leaving a single trace of himself behind. One night, under the soft amber glow of a lantern in a deserted piazza, Enzo was handed a particularly delicate assignment. A mid-ranking syndicate member had been siphoning money from the family's investments, and the Don wanted the situation rectified quietly. The man's movements were irregular, his routine full of unpredictable patterns. To most, tracking him would have been impossible. To Enzo, it was simply a matter of listening, observing, and understanding, a rhythm. He followed the man for days, noting his coffee stops, the slight limp when he hurried, the way his eyes lingered on certain shop windows. He memorized routes, entrances, and exits, predicting movements almost before they occurred. The night of execution was typical for him, measured. Quiet, precise. He cornered the man in an abandoned warehouse near the riverbank, where only the water and the echoing walls bore witness. There was no shouting, no struggle. Just a breath, a whisper, a movement so fluid it seemed part of the shadows themselves. When the deed was done, Enzo vanished, leaving nothing but the faint scent of wet stone and the lingering fear in the mind of those who would discover the body the next morning. No one could tie the act to him. Few even believed that the man had been eliminated intentionally. That was the essence of his skill, invisibility, and the ability to make fear appear as coincidence. Yet despite his growing reputation, Enzo felt an unease that he could not shake. The city's underworld, though sophisticated, was rife with hidden tensions. Allies turned to enemies with a glance, debts were repaid with betrayal, and the shadow of Don Marino's own manipulations reached further than Enzo could ever anticipate. It was during quiet moments, high above the city from a narrow balcony, that he realized the truth. no amount of skill could shield him from the unpredictability of human greed. Invisibility could protect him from physical danger, but it could not protect him from the shifting loyalties that surrounded him like a tidal wave. It was in this climate of calculated danger that Enzo's philosophy began to crystallize. He understood that precision alone was insufficient, anticipation was necessary. Every decision had to account not only for the immediate outcome but also for the chain reaction it might trigger. He began keeping mental maps of power structures, noting who owed whom favors, who held grudges, and who might act impulsively. His mind became a ledger as intricate and exacting as any financial record he had ever delivered, except this ledger tracked lives, influence, and potential threats. Rome, with all its grandeur and chaos, also exposed him to the art of patience. In Palermo, events were immediate, violent, and raw. Here, timing mattered more than speed, observation more than brute force. The city itself seemed to teach him this, a living classroom where shadows hid as much as they revealed, where opportunity could appear in a whisper and vanish just as silently. Nights were his teachers, and solitude was his mentor. He learned to feel the rhythm of a city breathing, to sense tension before it erupted, to move with it rather than against it. During these years, Enzo also began to refine his signature approach, the elimination without trace. It was not enough to strike, the act itself had to leave no evidence, no clue, and no emotional imprint beyond the inevitable fear. He experimented with different methods, subtle poisons that mimicked natural causes, staged accidents that appeared entirely coincidental, precise physical eliminations that left no marks detectable by casual observers. Each method was tested, each action rehearsed mentally before it was carried out. The goal was always the same, absolute discretion. His reputation continued to grow, whispered among the underworld elite and feared by those who had never seen him. The men and women of Rome's criminal network spoke of Il Cicero as though he were a force of nature, inevitable, invisible, and unstoppable. Yet despite the growing legend, Enzo remained solitary, almost ascetic in his detachment. Relationships, attachments, even fleeting friendships were liabilities. Trust could not be given, it could only be earned with observation and verified over time. Enzo trusted only himself, and even then, cautiously. By the time he had reached his late 20s, he had become a master not only of execution but of strategy, manipulation, and psychological precision. His silence, once a shield, had evolved into a weapon, one that shaped events, controlled perception, and instilled fear without ever raising a hand in obvious violence. And still, he felt the quiet pull of destiny, a sense that his life was a bridge between two worlds, the visible and the invisible, the feared and the unknown, the hunted and the hunter. Every shadow in Rome, every whispered rumor, every careful step across the cobblestones, served as both preparation and prelude. Enzo had become more than a man, he had become an idea, the embodiment of patience, precision, and inevitability. The city slept, unaware of the ghost walking among it. And though he moved quietly, with calm detachment, he knew the future would demand more, greater risks, deeper strategy, and an understanding that survival required not just skill, but foresight. The whisper had mastered execution. Now, he was learning mastery itself. The summer of Rome had a weight to it, thick with heat and the scent of stone warmed by the sun. Nights were long and humid, the kind that made the city feel alive even when its citizens were supposed to be asleep. For Enzo, these nights were never restful. He had learned early that comfort was a luxury, and in the underworld, vigilance was the only true companion. Even in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, perched above a quiet piazza, he felt the pulse of the city, a rhythm that demanded attention, patience, and silence. Every shadow could hide a friend or foe, every footstep might herald opportunity or threat. By now, Enzo's reputation had spread not only through Rome but also to the smaller cities across central Italy. Syndicate leaders and mid-tier operators alike spoke of him with a mix of fear and reverence, passing along the tales in whispers. The details were often vague: a man disappeared without a trace, a ledger vanished, a misstep in the network corrected before anyone realized it had happened, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Those who had encountered Il Cicero or even felt the weight of his presence spoke of him as a principle rather than a man, inevitability made flesh, a force that operated quietly but with precision, and always effectively. It was during this period that Enzo faced his first real test of moral calculation, a challenge that would define his philosophy in the years to come. A courier had been compromised, caught passing sensitive information between syndicate families. The Don, concerned with maintaining appearances, ordered that the courier disappear. Enzo's role was to orchestrate the removal. There was no ambiguity in the task, no question of survival for the target. But as he studied the man, a young, nervous figure who reminded him uncomfortably of his own past, he noted hesitation, fear, and pleading. The man had done nothing malicious, merely naive and trapped by circumstance. And yet, Enzo had learned that circumstance was irrelevant, only outcome mattered. He followed the courier for days, noting his habits, predicting movements, and calculating the precise moment when the operation could proceed without risk. The city itself seemed to conspire with him, shadows stretching just so, moonlight reflecting off windows to guide him, and the hum of distant traffic masking his passage. When the moment arrived, Enzo acted with his usual precision, swift, silent, final. The courier was removed without incident, leaving no trace, no scene, no chaos. And yet, for the first time, Enzo felt the faint stirrings of conflict within him. The city had taught him patience, observation, and execution, but it had not taught how to reconcile necessity with conscience. Around the same time, Enzo began to realize the subtleties of power that extended beyond violence. He observed the family's politics, their intricate systems of favors, debts, and influence. Men who seemed loyal could turn suddenly, their greed or fear outweighing friendship or promises. Those who wielded influence did so not only with threats but with suggestion, persuasion, and careful timing. Enzo absorbed these lessons like a student of the world, noting who acted out of emotion versus calculation, and learning to mirror the same detachment in his own decisions. In this environment, he understood that an assassin's value was not measured solely in completed tasks but in the ability to influence outcomes invisibly, shaping the world without ever revealing his hand. Enzo's presence became increasingly mythic. He was known to have completed operations that seemed impossible, a key witness silenced before trial, a business dispute resolved without court involvement, a betrayal rectified before it could damage the syndicate. And yet, he never appeared in the same place twice in a short span, never left a recognizable pattern, and never allowed familiarity to compromise his advantage. Colleagues in Rome and beyond speculated about him constantly. Was he a man, a ghost, or merely a clever rumor? These uncertainties worked to his advantage, keeping him a step ahead of anyone who might seek to confront him. One evening, as the city simmered in the heat of July, Enzo received an unusual assignment. A former ally had crossed the Don, allegedly providing information to the authorities. The assignment was delicate, the man's disappearance could not be linked to the family, yet the Don demanded resolution. Enzo approached it as always, studying the target, noting every movement, and predicting every reaction. The first time he entered the man's apartment, he found him awake, aware, but panicked. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Enzo saw not just fear but recognition, the realization that the unseen had arrived. The man froze, unable to move, as Enzo completed the task with the same calm detachment that had defined him for years. But it was after this operation that Enzo began to notice a shift in the way he was perceived. Allies who had once seen him as a tool now regarded him with wariness, and rivals who had dismissed him as myth began to tread carefully. He had become more than executor. He had become arbiter. A single presence, a single movement could influence events, alter loyalties, and redirect power without uttering a word. In Rome, whispers spread that Il Cicero could appear anywhere, anytime, and that his interventions left no evidence except for the inevitability of consequence. Yet, even as he honed his craft and expanded his influence, Enzo remained isolated. Friendships, attachments, and emotional bonds were liabilities in a world built on fear, secrecy, and betrayal. Nights were spent alone, often atop rooftops or along the riverbanks, observing the city, calculating outcomes, and reflecting on the nature of his work. He realized that mastery of the shadows demanded not only skill but discipline, detachment, and an understanding of human psychology on a level that few could attain. In these quiet hours, the city's heartbeat became his own, synchronizing with his thoughts, his planning, his silent vigilance. It was also during this period that Enzo began refining his approach to perception management, the art of manipulating what others believed they knew. He would leave deliberate traces to mislead, craft subtle patterns that suggested the presence of others, and create illusions that kept rivals guessing. By controlling perception, he could act without interference, eliminating obstacles while remaining invisible. Rome had become a canvas for these lessons, its crowded streets and shadowed corners serving as both practice ground and theater for his growing legend. By the end of this chapter of his life, Enzo was no longer merely a young assassin or a quiet observer. He was a master of invisibility, anticipation, and psychological influence. He understood that power was often silent, subtle, and carefully orchestrated, a whisper that could carry further than a shout. And though the city around him slept, oblivious to the forces at play, Enzo moved through it like a heartbeat beneath the pavement, unseen, inevitable, and entirely his own. Rome had taught him patience, precision, and the delicate balance between observation and action. But more importantly, it had taught him a lesson that Palermo could not. In a world where loyalty was fleeting and ambition unrelenting, survival demanded more than skill. It demanded foresight, strategy, and the ability to become a ghost even among shadows. And Enzo, Illinois Cicero, had learned that lesson well. The cool autumn air in Rome carried a different kind of weight than the humid summers Enzo had grown accustomed to. The streets were quieter now, the tourists gone, and the city settled into a rhythm that only the initiated could read. To the casual observer, Rome appeared serene and eternal, its cobblestones glowing softly in the amber light of street lamps, its fountains murmuring quietly in the piazzas. But beneath that tranquil surface flowed currents of power, fear, and ambition that Enzo had long learned to navigate. He had moved through the city like smoke, and yet he sensed that the game he had been playing was about to change, growing more intricate and dangerous with every passing day. It started subtly. A series of minor betrayals, whispered rumors of alliances forming without the Don's knowledge, hints that someone within the network had grown impatient, ambitious, or reckless. Enzo noticed them first, of course, the faint glance exchanged between two men in a cafe, the hesitation in a courier's gate, the slightly too eager obedience of someone who should have been experienced. Each observation was a thread, and Enzo began weaving them together, tracing patterns that revealed not just individual treachery, but a network of shifting loyalties that threatened to destabilize everything Marino had built. One evening, as fog rolled in from the Tiber, Enzo shadowed a minor player in the syndicate, a man whose apparent loyalty was beginning to waver. The man moved through the streets with exaggerated confidence, trying to hide nervous glances over his shoulder. Enzo observed silently from across the square, hidden behind a column, noting how he avoided certain routes and frequented others unexpectedly. That night, he followed him to a secluded warehouse, the faint clatter of machinery and the smell of oil greeting him as he approached. Inside, he found evidence of a secret meeting, ledgers, documents, and correspondence that suggested coordination with rival factions. The man's minor act of rebellion had ripple effects that, if left unchecked, could ignite chaos. Enzo's solution was methodical. He didn't act with the rush of anger or emotion, instead, he crafted a plan that would neutralize the threat without creating attention. Over the next few days, he monitored movements, memorized entrances and exits, and even anticipated who might notice if changes occurred. On a chilly night, he executed his plan, removing key documents, creating diversions, and ensuring that those who could expose the meeting would remain unaware. By morning, the threat was dissolved. The man was left in his position, unsuspecting, unaware of the subtle yet irreversible shift Enzo had imposed. Rome's underworld never suspected a whisper had passed through its ranks and changed the course of events quietly but decisively. This episode marked a turning point. Enzo began to understand that influence in the syndicate was not purely physical. The art of control extended beyond fear and violence. It encompassed manipulation, observation, and the ability to predict human behavior with near-perfect accuracy. The shadows were no longer simply a refuge, they had become instruments, a means to orchestrate outcomes without detection. The city itself, with its narrow alleys, towering structures, and hidden passages, offered endless opportunities for such precision. Every corridor, every courtyard, every unlit stairwell could be a stage for his work, and Enzo learned to navigate them with the elegance of a conductor guiding a symphony. Amid these operations, he also began to consider the psychological dimensions of fear. He observed how rumors, when carefully seeded, could shape behavior and reinforce power structures. A well-placed word, a faint hint, or even a missing ledger could provoke panic, paranoia, or submission, all without the need for violence. Enzo experimented subtly, observing the reactions of targets, refining his understanding of human perception. His legend grew not because of the acts he performed openly, but because of the invisible influence he wielded. Those who encountered his effects often whispered about inevitability, attributing his interventions to coincidence or fate rather than the meticulous calculation behind them. Yet, even as his control expanded, Enzo remained vigilant against complacency. Rome was a city of endless variables, and mastery required constant adaptation. One misstep could undo years of careful planning, one lapse in attention could turn loyalty into betrayal. Enzo developed routines that accounted for chance encounters, unexpected movements, and the unpredictable behavior of men driven by fear or desire. He studied patterns of light, sound, and movement, learning how the city itself could aid or hinder his operations. Each night, he walked streets alone, testing these patterns, feeling the pulse of the city as though it were an extension of himself. It was during one of these solitary walks, along the banks of the Tiber, that he noticed a subtle but alarming pattern. A man had been following him for several nights, never approaching, always maintaining distance. The observation set a new challenge in motion. Enzo did not panic, he analyzed. Who was this follower? Ally or enemy? Observation, anticipation, and patience, the principles he had honed for years, guided his response. Over the next week, he turned the pursuit into a study, subtly altering his routes, observing the man's reactions, and learning the identity and intent of his silent observer. By the time the man revealed himself, Enzo was ready. The encounter ended quietly, without confrontation, the threat neutralized before it could materialize. These months in Rome deepened his understanding of the delicate balance between action and restraint. Enzo realized that power was often strongest when invisible, that the absence of presence could be more persuasive than its assertion. His movements were deliberate, calculated, and almost ceremonial, each step reinforcing his reputation while remaining unseen. The city had taught him that violence, though sometimes necessary, was only one of many instruments at his disposal. Subtlety, timing, and perception could shape outcomes more effectively than any weapon. By the end of that autumn, Enzo had solidified his position not merely as a skilled operative but as an arbiter of outcomes, a silent force capable of influencing the course of events without revealing his hand. Rome itself had become a partner in his work, its labyrinthine streets, hidden courtyards, and unlit alleys serving as both playground and canvas. Enzo moved with a quiet inevitability, a ghost whose presence was felt only in the consequences he left behind. And as the leaves fell and the nights grew longer, he began to understand a truth that would guide the next chapter of his life, that mastery over silence, anticipation, and perception was more powerful than mastery over any blade or bullet, and in the shadows of Rome, Illinois Cicero had become untouchable. The chill of early winter settled over Rome, casting the city in a pale, almost ethereal light. The cobblestones glistened under the mist, and the distant hum of the Tiber flowed like a soft whisper through the streets. For Enzo, the quiet hours between dusk and dawn were the moments when his mind was sharpest, when observation and anticipation could operate without interruption. The city itself seemed to bend around him, as if aware of the ghost walking among its shadows, guiding him, testing him, and teaching him the limits of patience and precision. By now, he had become a figure of silent legend, a presence felt but never seen, whose influence could ripple through the underworld like a subtle current, reshaping events before anyone realized. It was during this winter that Enzo was faced with a challenge that tested not only his skill but his judgment. A mid-level operative within the syndicate had begun siphoning funds and providing intelligence to a rival faction. The dawn demanded resolution. Yet there was a complication: the man's family was well connected, and any overt action could ignite retaliation or attract the attention of law enforcement. Enzo understood immediately that conventional approaches, brute force or obvious elimination, would be catastrophic. Instead, he crafted a plan rooted in manipulation, foresight, and psychological precision. For days, he shadowed the man's movements, noting his routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities. He studied the way the man interacted with colleagues, observing subtle gestures that betrayed worry or duplicity. Enzo's mind worked like a clock, calculating probabilities, anticipating reactions, and creating contingencies for every potential outcome. He understood that timing was as crucial as execution. An operation carried out even minutes too early or too late could unravel entirely. The city itself became his laboratory, every alley and street corner a variable in his calculations. On the night of the operation, Enzo executed with the calm detachment that had defined him for years. He intercepted the target in a deserted passageway, neutralizing the threat with swift precision that left no trace. But his work was not yet complete. Using the man's connections and the hidden documents he had gathered, Enzo planted subtle evidence of betrayal, steering suspicion toward rivals while ensuring the syndicate remained unaware of the true orchestrator. By the time the morning sun reflected off the Tiber, the operation had been resolved flawlessly, the rival faction misled, the syndicate stabilized, and the man neutralized in a manner that appeared accidental or inevitable. This success marked a shift in Enzo's role. He was no longer merely a silent executor, he was a strategist, capable of shaping events without leaving a single clue. The whispers about Il Cicero grew louder, reaching even the ears of those who prided themselves on being untouchable. Men began to tread carefully, their confidence tempered by the knowledge that a single misstep could invoke consequences they might never trace to their source. And yet, for all the acclaim his actions inspired in certain circles, Enzo remained solitary, understanding that the power of invisibility required detachment, precision, and above all, patience. The winter deepened, and with it came assignments of increasing complexity. Enzo found himself navigating the treacherous interplay of multiple families, mediating disputes, and eliminating threats before they could escalate. Each mission demanded not only physical skill but also mental acuity, a capacity to predict human behavior, and the subtle art of misdirection. He had begun to master a form of invisible influence, shaping outcomes and ensuring compliance without ever drawing attention to himself. By the subtle deployment of rumors, minor interventions, and carefully timed disappearances, he could control the flow of information, fear, and loyalty with unparalleled efficiency. Yet with every success, Enzo's awareness of the fragility of his position grew. The same skills that made him formidable could also make him a target. In Rome, alliances shifted like sand, and trust was a currency almost impossible to earn. He remained vigilant, scanning every shadow, analyzing every glance, and anticipating even the slightest deviation from expected behavior. Enzo had learned to recognize the invisible threads of ambition and fear that connected people, understanding that a single act of misjudgment could unravel years of careful work. Amid these dangerous months, Enzo also began to reflect on the paradox of power and isolation. In Palermo, he had been a shadow in a familiar city; in Rome, he was a ghost whose influence was felt more than his presence. The recognition he gained carried no companionship, no loyalty, and no comfort. Nights spent alone became a sanctuary for thought, planning, and reflection. He would often find himself on rooftops, gazing at the softly lit piazzas below, contemplating the balance between control and detachment, influence and invisibility. The city's quiet rhythms became a meditation, a way to sharpen his senses and refine his understanding of human behavior. During this period, Enzo also refined his ability to manipulate perception. He understood that people often acted not according to reality, but according to what they believed to be true. By carefully seeding doubt, misdirection, or subtle suggestions, he could control outcomes without overt action. It was a psychological craft that complemented his physical skills, allowing him to act as both sword and shadow simultaneously. The city itself provided endless opportunities. Crowded markets, winding alleyways, and silent courtyards became instruments through which he orchestrated influence and controlled perception. The culmination of this period came with a particularly delicate operation. A meeting between rival families was arranged under the guise of negotiation, but the true intent was sabotage. Enzo's role was to ensure that the wrong messages reached the wrong ears, that subtle cues created mistrust, and that the meeting dissolved into suspicion without violence that could attract law enforcement attention. He moved through the event like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, yet fully in command of the narrative. By the time the meeting concluded, the intended consequences had been achieved. No one suspected the source of the manipulation, but the balance of power had quietly shifted. By the end of that winter, Enzo had evolved beyond the boy who had first delivered envelopes on Palermo's docks. He was a master of observation, anticipation, and psychological strategy. His reputation as Il Cicero was no longer based solely on elimination but on the ability to orchestrate outcomes invisibly, leaving no evidence but the inevitability of consequence. Rome had become both a laboratory and a classroom, teaching him lessons in patience, perception, and the subtle art of control. And as he walked the quiet streets in the early hours, the fog curling around ancient buildings, Enzo understood a truth that would define him forever. Mastery was not about the visible act of violence, but about the unseen currents one could shape, the invisible threads one could pull, and the awareness that in a world of ambition and betrayal, it was the silent hand, not the loudest, that ultimately guided the outcome. Rome had made him more than an assassin, it had made him inevitable. The early months of the following year brought a damp, gray light to Rome. The kind that settled over the city like a slow tide, softening edges, muting colors, and creating shadows that stretched long across cobblestones. Enzo walked these streets with the ease of a man who had long since merged with the city's rhythm. Each alley, each narrow passageway, each courtyard had become an extension of himself, a network of observation points and escape routes meticulously memorized. But with familiarity came danger. In a city as alive and unpredictable as Rome, knowledge was only half the battle, the other half was the constant. Vigilance required to anticipate the ambitions, fears, and treacheries of those around him. By this time, Enzo's influence within the syndicate had grown substantially. He was no longer merely a ghost who executed assignments, he was a silent arbiter, shaping outcomes in ways that often went unnoticed but never unappreciated. Men who once feared only for their lives now feared the consequences of his observation, the subtle rearrangement of circumstances that could make a betrayal appear as misfortune or an error seem inevitable. Enzo's artistry lay in this subtlety, in controlling perception, manipulating outcomes, and leaving only whispers behind to suggest that something unseen had occurred. One such operation underscored the depth of his abilities. A mid-level operator had begun diverting resources from the syndicate, funneling funds to a nascent rival organization. The dawn demanded swift resolution, but any overt move could expose the family to scrutiny. Enzo devised a plan that combined patience, psychological insight, and precision execution. He observed the man for weeks, memorizing patterns of movement, noting habits, acquaintances, and predictable mistakes. The city itself, in its foggy early mornings and quiet late nights, provided him cover, a drifting mist that cloaked his presence, the distant murmur of traffic masking his steps, and the indifferent gaze of passers-by ensuring no witness would suspect a thing. When the moment arrived, Enzo acted with the quiet efficiency that had become his hallmark. He intercepted the man in a deserted courtyard, removing him from the equation without drama, without violence that could attract attention. But the true work was in the aftermath, careful misdirection, subtle cues planted to ensure blame and suspicion fell elsewhere, and documents strategically placed to guide perception. By sunrise, the threat had been neutralized, the syndicate's stability intact, and no one suspected that the hand behind it was that of Il Cicero. The beauty of it lay not in the act itself, but in the orchestration, the invisible strings that manipulated outcomes without leaving a trace. Enzo's skill was not only in action, but in foresight. He began mapping the alliances, grudges, and ambitions of those around him in increasing detail, turning the labyrinthine politics of Rome's underworld into a game of probabilities. He noted subtle shifts in behavior, a hesitated glance, a too long pause in conversation, a sudden interest in previously ignored affairs, and used these small signs to anticipate moves before they could be executed. In this way, he exerted influence without ever drawing attention, quietly shaping events, realigning loyalties, and ensuring outcomes that favored the family he served while remaining unseen. Yet, even in the midst of mastery, Enzo felt the weight of isolation. Rome's grandeur, its ancient stones, echoing piazzas, and hidden catacombs, offered him cover, but it did not fill the emptiness of solitude. He spent nights alone, atop rooftops or along the misted banks of the Tiber, watching the city breathe. He thought of Palermo, its harbor, and the narrow alleys he had once roamed as a boy, realizing that the path to mastery demanded not only skill but detachment. Relationships and attachments were liabilities, they dulled focus and introduced unpredictability. For Enzo, mastery required total immersion in the shadows, blending fully with the city, and allowing neither fear nor loyalty to compromise the precision he had honed over years. During this period, he also began experimenting with psychological manipulation more deliberately. He understood that human behavior often followed predictable patterns, that fear could be guided, suspicion seeded, and perception subtly controlled. Enzo refined methods to influence outcomes without ever resorting to violence, using rumors, misdirection, and carefully staged coincidences to bend events to his design. In doing so, he became more than a silent executor, he became a puppeteer whose strings were invisible, whose influence extended far beyond the immediate scope of any one mission. One particularly delicate assignment highlighted the extent of his capabilities. Two rival factions within Rome had been vying for control of a lucrative enterprise, and tensions threatened to spill into public violence. Enzo was tasked with orchestrating a resolution that preserved the syndicate's interests without triggering law enforcement intervention. Over several weeks, he monitored movements, identified alliances, and planted subtle cues that misled leaders into underestimating their rivals. By carefully controlling the flow of information and predicting reactions, he managed to de-escalate the situation entirely, turning a potential conflict into a negotiated understanding. The city remained unaware of the invisible hand that had guided events, and yet, within the underworld, his legend grew. Through operations such as these, Enzo began to recognize the true nature of his power. It was not merely in execution or stealth, but in the orchestration of perception, in shaping decisions before they could manifest, in controlling outcomes without ever revealing the actor. Rome had become his canvas, the shadows his tools, and the city's pulse his guide. He moved with a quiet inevitability, ensuring that the consequences of his actions appeared as chance, coincidence, or fate, when in reality, they were meticulously engineered. By the end of that winter, Enzo had solidified his role as more than an assassin, he was a strategist, a manipulator of events, and a master of influence. His presence was felt even by those who had never seen him, a subtle terror that shaped behavior and altered loyalties without a single visible act. And as he walked through the quiet streets, listening to the soft murmur of fountains and the distant echo of footsteps, he understood a profound truth: true mastery lay not in the obvious display of power, but in the silent, invisible hand that moved events toward inevitability. Rome had taught him that skill alone was insufficient, foresight, patience, and psychological precision were the instruments of true control. And Enzo, Illinois Cicero, had become their master. The early spring in Rome brought a soft, golden haze over the city's ancient stones. The streets, usually bustling with merchants, tourists, and the occasional curious observer, seemed to Enzo to take on a rhythm of their own, one that he had learned to read and manipulate. Each morning, as sunlight fell across the piazzas and through narrow alleyways, he moved with quiet precision, attuned to the subtleties of the city. Rome, with its layers of history and shadow, had become both his playground and his classroom, a living organism whose pulse he could feel beneath his feet. Every footstep, every flicker of movement, every whispered conversation carried information, and Enzo had become adept at deciphering it, reading the invisible currents of power that flowed just beneath the surface. By now, he was deeply entrenched in the intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and delicate balances that defined Rome's criminal underworld. His role had evolved far beyond the execution of discrete eliminations. He had become a strategist, an invisible force capable of influencing outcomes without being seen or suspected. Men who had once wielded authority with arrogance now approached their dealings with caution, aware of the silent presence that could shift events with subtlety rather than force. Enzo's artistry lay not in overt displays of power, but in his understanding of human behavior, the psychology of fear, and the manipulation of perception. During this period, a situation arose that would test his ingenuity and patience to their limits. A powerful syndicate family had begun encroaching on territories traditionally controlled by his employers. The Don, cautious and calculating, required a resolution that avoided open conflict while reasserting dominance. Enzo was tasked with orchestrating the solution, but the challenge was immense. It was not a matter of force, it was a matter of anticipation, misdirection, and subtle pressure. Enzo observed the rival faction meticulously, mapping out their routines, identifying weak points, and predicting likely reactions. Every step, every conversation, every meeting became part of a larger mental map, a chessboard upon which he would move unseen pieces to achieve the desired outcome. The execution of his plan was nothing short of artistry. Over several weeks, Enzo manipulated the flow of information, subtly influencing decisions, seeding doubt, and creating the impression of miscalculations on the part of the rival family. He moved through the city like a ghost, invisible and undetectable, leaving only carefully engineered consequences in his wake. By the time the rival faction realized what had occurred, it was too late. The balance of power had quietly shifted, loyalties realigned, and the Don's authority reinforced. Rome remained blissfully unaware, its citizens none the wiser to the invisible hand that had steered events with precision. It was in these operations that Enzo's understanding of patience deepened. He realized that immediate action was often less effective than careful anticipation, that a well-placed pause, a deliberate delay, or a subtle suggestion could achieve far more than overt intervention. He honed his ability to wait, to observe, and to let events unfold in such a way that his influence was felt without being detected. Rome, with its winding streets, crowded piazzas, and quiet corners, offered endless opportunities to practice this craft, and Enzo embraced it fully. During these months, he also began to refine his methods of psychological influence. He understood that people's actions were often guided not by reality, but by what they believed to be true. By controlling perception, planting suggestions, and guiding suspicion subtly, he could shape outcomes without ever revealing his hand. Letters disappeared, documents were misplaced, and alliances shifted, all orchestrated in such a way that the participants were unaware of the invisible force shaping their choices. Enzo's genius lay in making the improbable inevitable, in turning chance into design without anyone noticing the manipulation. Yet even as he expanded his influence, Enzo remained acutely aware of the fragility of his position. Rome was a city of ambition and greed, and trust was a scarce commodity. One misstep, one lapse in observation, could expose him or compromise years of carefully cultivated control. He remained vigilant, scanning shadows, analyzing glances, and anticipating deviations from expected behavior. His solitary existence, though isolating, allowed him to maintain the clarity and focus necessary for survival and mastery. One particular night, Enzo faced an unexpected challenge. A young operative, inexperienced and reckless, had unwittingly endangered a high-stakes negotiation. The Don's patience was thin, and the consequences of failure could have been catastrophic. Enzo observed the young man's behavior, predicted his next moves, and intervened subtly, redirecting the unfolding events without ever making his presence known. By dawn, the situation had stabilized, the negotiation concluded favorably, and the Don remained unaware of the silent orchestration that had occurred. Enzo's skill lay in this invisible manipulation, a blend of observation, anticipation, and psychological precision that allowed him to guide outcomes while remaining unseen. Through these experiences, Enzo's legend continued to grow. Whispers of Il Cicero reached even those who had never directly encountered him. He was described as an inevitability, a force that operated quietly but decisively, a shadow whose influence could be felt without ever being traced. And yet, for all his notoriety, he remained a solitary figure, moving through the city like a ghost, ever vigilant, ever patient, and ever precise. The streets of Rome had become both his domain and his mentor, teaching him the delicate balance of power, perception, and patience that would define his future. By the end of this period, Enzo had not only mastered the art of elimination and influence but had also cultivated an almost supernatural understanding of human behavior. He could anticipate fear, predict ambition, and manipulate perception with a subtlety that left no evidence of his hand. Rome had become a proving ground, a canvas, and a laboratory for his abilities, and he had emerged as more than an assassin. He had become a strategist, a manipulator, and an invisible arbiter whose quiet interventions shaped the course of events without ever revealing their architect. In the quiet hours, as the city slept under the soft glow of street lamps, Enzo understood that true mastery lay not in overt action, but in the silent, deliberate orchestration of outcomes, and he had become their unparalleled master. The late spring in Rome carried with it a gentle warmth, the kind that softened the edges of the ancient city while allowing shadows to stretch longer and conceal more. For Enzo, this was the perfect season to observe, to move, and to plan. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Rome, attuned to the subtle variations in behavior, light, and sound that gave him an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings. Each alleyway, courtyard, and narrow staircase had become part of his mental map, a network of possibilities, exits, and observation points that allowed him to operate with unparalleled precision. The city, in its beauty and complexity, was both his sanctuary and his proving ground, a living organism whose heartbeat he could feel beneath his feet. Enzo's work had expanded in scope. No longer was he only tasked with the elimination of threats or the quiet removal of obstacles. Now, his assignments demanded strategic orchestration, influence had to be exercised without leaving evidence, rivalries redirected without detection, and perception controlled so that outcomes appeared natural or inevitable. The Don trusted him implicitly, not simply because of his skill in execution, but because Enzo had demonstrated the ability to navigate the most complex human dynamics with subtlety and foresight. His reputation as Il Cicero had grown, whispered throughout the underworld as a man who could appear without being seen and whose interventions were felt without ever being traced. One particular case tested his abilities to their fullest. A faction within the syndicate had begun to conspire against the Don, coordinating with rival families to gain territory and influence. A direct confrontation would have been disastrous, law enforcement could be drawn in, and collateral damage would undermine the Don's authority. Enzo approached the problem differently. He became a silent observer, studying patterns, noting alliances, predicting behavior, and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited without direct confrontation. He mapped the web of influence, observing interactions and tracing loyalties with the meticulousness of a cartographer charting hidden rivers and secret passageways. His plan unfolded over weeks. Enzo subtly manipulated information, intercepted communications, and planted seeds of doubt among conspirators. Letters would disappear, messages misdirected, and whispers would reach ears where they would do the most damage, all without ever appearing directly involved. The conspirators, believing themselves clever, acted according to the cues Enzo provided, sealing their own downfall through misjudgment. By the time the Don received word, the threat had been neutralized entirely, with no violence necessary and no suspicion directed toward Enzo. It was a masterclass in influence, strategy, and discretion, and it solidified his role as more than an enforcer. He was an invisible architect of outcomes. During these months, Enzo also honed his understanding of human psychology. He realized that fear, desire, and ambition could be guided with the same precision as any physical action. By controlling perception, he could shape choices before they were consciously made, and by anticipating responses, he could orchestrate events as if moving chess pieces on a board. Rome, with its crowded markets, silent alleyways, and echoing piazzas, became both his classroom and his stage. Every interaction, every hesitation, and every glance was data to be interpreted and used in shaping outcomes. Enzo's influence extended beyond the syndicate's internal affairs. He began observing rival families, understanding their structures, vulnerabilities, and ambitions. By identifying subtle cracks in their relationships and exploiting misunderstandings, he could preemptively neutralize threats or redirect conflicts in ways that benefited the Don's interests. He was no longer reacting to danger, he was predicting and shaping it. The art of anticipation had become as vital as the art of execution. Yet with increased influence came increased risk. The more Enzo manipulated events, the more potential existed for exposure or retaliation. He remained vigilant, always scanning for anomalies, watching the subtle behaviors that hinted at deception, and preparing contingencies for every possible scenario. He had learned that trust was a luxury in Rome's underworld, and even those closest to the Don could be swayed by ambition or fear. His solitude was not loneliness but a calculated necessity, ensuring that his focus remained undiluted and his actions precise. One operation that stood out during this period involved a carefully staged confrontation between two factions. A rivalry had been escalating quietly, threatening to erupt into violence that could draw police attention. Enzo orchestrated the encounter to appear accidental, planting misinformation and guiding participants' perceptions so that tensions were diffused without anyone realizing his hand was involved. By the time the dust settled, the factions had been redirected, loyalties reinforced, and the Don's control maintained, all under the illusion of natural resolution. Rome itself had become a silent partner in his work, its streets and structures shaping and concealing his influence. Through these experiences, Enzo's mastery deepened. He understood that power often resided in invisibility and anticipation rather than in brute force. The quiet orchestration of perception, the precise manipulation of events, and the patient observation of human behavior had become his signature. Enzo had become not just a feared assassin but an indispensable strategist, one whose influence extended far beyond the visible consequences of his actions. By the time summer approached, Enzo had reached a new level of expertise. His legend as Il Cicero was cemented, rivals whispered of his inevitability, allies revered his discretion, and the Don relied on his guidance in ways that transcended traditional assignments. Rome had taught him patience, foresight, and the delicate art of invisible control. And in the quiet hours, as he moved through fog-laden streets and watched the city's heartbeat beneath the ancient stones, Enzo understood that his true power lay not in the acts he performed, but in the outcomes he orchestrated, unseen, inevitable, and perfectly executed. The city of Rome in early summer carried a languid, almost hypnotic rhythm. The streets glimmered with the reflection of the midday sun on cobblestones, while the scent of baked bread and faint perfume drifted through the air, mingling with the distant murmur of fountains. For most, it was a city of beauty, history, and daily routine. For Enzo, however, it was a living map, a network of movement, opportunity, and concealment. Each building, archway, and narrow alleyway provided both a route and a vantage point. Over the years, he had become attuned to the subtle shifts in the city, the way a shadow fell at different hours, how footsteps echoed differently on certain streets, how patterns of behavior among the city's denizens could reveal more than they intended. Rome had become both mentor and partner, teaching him the patience, precision, and adaptability that would define the next phase of his life. It was during this period that Enzo was presented with a complex challenge that would test the full range of his abilities. A rival faction, previously considered dormant and insignificant, had begun asserting itself, targeting the syndicate's interests through subtle sabotage and strategic disruption. Their methods were indirect but effective: shipments delayed, communications intercepted, minor operatives misled. To confront them openly would risk escalation and law enforcement attention, yet allowing their interference to continue unchecked would undermine the Don's authority. Enzo understood immediately that a direct approach would be ineffective. What was required was subtle orchestration, anticipation, and psychological insight. Enzo began by observing the faction's key figures, mapping their routines, alliances, and weaknesses. Every glance, hesitation, and interaction became data. He noted the unspoken tensions between members, the patterns of trust and suspicion, and the small cracks that could be leveraged. Over days and nights, he traced their movements through the city, learning which areas they preferred, which streets offered concealment, and which associates they relied upon most. Rome itself provided both cover and complexity, a labyrinth that amplified the effectiveness of careful planning while presenting hidden dangers for the inattentive. When he began to act, it was with the subtlety of a master painter applying the first strokes to a canvas. Enzo intervened indirectly, guiding the faction's decisions through misinformation, carefully timed coincidences, and the manipulation of perceived opportunity. Key documents were misdirected, allies subtly influenced, and misunderstandings cultivated to create internal tension. All the while, Enzo remained unseen, moving like a ghost, his presence known only through the consequences of his actions. By the time the rival faction realized their plans had faltered, it was already too late, their efforts had been neutralized without a single overt confrontation. During this period, Enzo also further refined his understanding of human psychology. He observed how fear, ambition, and greed could be guided with precision. By predicting emotional responses, he could anticipate decisions before they were made, shaping outcomes in ways that appeared coincidental or inevitable. This was the subtle art that defined his work, the ability to orchestrate events invisibly, to manipulate perception, and to achieve objectives without ever revealing his hand. Rome became both stage and laboratory, each operation an opportunity to test, refine, and perfect his techniques. One operation, in particular, required extraordinary patience. A minor operative had stumbled upon information that could expose the syndicate's plans to an outside faction. Enzo monitored the situation carefully, anticipating the operative's movements, predicting whom he might trust, and preparing interventions that would redirect outcomes without arousing suspicion. The resolution was quiet, precise, and invisible. By the time the operative realized he had been guided, the threat was neutralized, and the syndicate's interests remained secure. This operation reinforced a principle that had become central to Enzo's approach: influence was often more effective than force, and invisibility often more powerful than visibility. As his operations grew in complexity, Enzo also began to consider the symbolic nature of his work. He realized that reputation, perception, and myth could be leveraged as effectively as any weapon. The whisper of Il Cicero through the underworld instilled caution, fear, and respect, qualities that extended his influence far beyond his immediate actions. Competitors and allies alike began to move more carefully, guided by the invisible presence that they could feel but never see. Rome had become a city where even the most confident men adjusted their steps because of the unseen hand guiding events. Yet, amid these successes, Enzo remained acutely aware of the fragility of his position. One miscalculation could unravel years of careful planning, and even a minor exposure could bring unwanted scrutiny or retaliation. He remained vigilant at all times, analyzing behavior, anticipating moves, and maintaining the discipline that had allowed him to thrive. His solitude, while isolating, provided the clarity and focus necessary to remain one step ahead in a world where a single mistake could be fatal. By the end of this summer, Enzo had achieved a level of mastery that few could rival. He was no longer simply an assassin or a courier of consequence, he was a strategist, a manipulator of events, and a master of invisible influence. His presence was felt even when unseen, his guidance shaping outcomes, and his understanding of human behavior allowing him to orchestrate complex operations with quiet precision. Rome had become both canvas and mentor, teaching him that power lay not in visibility but in subtlety, in patience, and in the careful orchestration of perception. And as the city settled into the long nights of early summer, Enzo moved through its streets like a ghost, inevitable, untouchable, and perfectly attuned to the rhythm of his unseen dominion. The heat of midsummer in Rome carried a slow, almost dreamlike weight. The city seemed to breathe differently during these months, its ancient stones radiating warmth long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. Fountains murmured softly in the piazzas, their gentle splashes providing a calming counterpoint to the distant hum of footsteps on cobblestones. For most, the nights were an invitation to stroll, to linger over wine, or to enjoy the languid rhythm of the city. For Enzo, however, the nights were a canvas, a living map upon which he could move unseen, observing, calculating, and influencing with subtle precision. Rome had become an extension of himself, and he had learned to feel the pulse of its streets, to anticipate movements, and to manipulate outcomes without leaving a trace. This period of Enzo's life was marked by operations of increasing sophistication. Simple executions had long been behind him, now, he orchestrated events with a finesse that required not only physical skill but psychological mastery. Rival factions, ambitious operatives, and even the occasional corrupt law enforcement official were all part of a delicate ecosystem he monitored and influenced. Each person's actions, each decision, each hesitation became data, pieces in a larger puzzle that Enzo could manipulate with precision. The artistry of his work lay not in overt action, but in the orchestration of perception, in the silent shaping of outcomes that others attributed to chance, coincidence, or fate. One such operation involved a group of mid-level operatives whose growing recklessness threatened to disrupt the Don's carefully maintained balance of power. They were ambitious, impatient, and overconfident, qualities that could be exploited if approached with subtlety. Enzo spent weeks observing them, learning their habits, noting their interactions, and identifying the fissures in their loyalty. Every movement they made was catalogued, every conversation overheard or inferred, and every emotional reaction carefully analyzed. He began to craft a plan that would redirect their ambition, guide their decisions, and neutralize the threat without the need for violence that could draw attention. When the moment arrived, Enzo executed his strategy with a precision that could only come from years of experience and an intimate understanding of human behavior. Small manipulations, a misplaced letter, a carefully planted rumor, a delayed message, shifted the balance, turning their own decisions against them. The operatives believed they were acting independently, unaware that their actions had been orchestrated from the shadows. By the time the Don received word of the events, the threat had been neutralized, alliances had been realigned, and the underworld's equilibrium remained intact. Enzo's role was invisible, yet utterly decisive, a silent hand guiding events without ever being seen. During these months, Enzo also deepened his mastery of psychological influence. He understood that perception often mattered more than reality. By subtly altering what people believed, by guiding their interpretations and manipulating the flow of information, he could shape choices before they were even made. Fear, ambition, loyalty, and suspicion became tools in his hands, instruments that allowed him to orchestrate outcomes that appeared inevitable but were in fact carefully engineered. Rome itself provided a perfect theater for this craft, its labyrinthine streets, hidden courtyards, and quiet alleys offering endless opportunities for subtle intervention and observation. Yet, despite his growing legend, Enzo remained acutely aware of the dangers inherent in his position. The more influential he became, the greater the scrutiny from those who feared or envied him. One misstep could unravel years of carefully constructed control, and even the slightest exposure could invite retaliation or investigation. Vigilance was constant, Enzo never allowed himself to be complacent. Every shadow, every glance, every unexpected movement was noted and analyzed. The city had taught him that survival demanded not only skill and strategy but also discipline, patience, and detachment. During one particularly tense operation, Enzo had to intervene in a conflict between two rival factions vying for control of a lucrative enterprise. Open confrontation was impossible, the consequences would draw law enforcement attention and destabilize the Don's influence. Instead, Enzo crafted an invisible resolution. By planting subtle suggestions, misdirecting key communications, and manipulating perception, he redirected the faction's actions to achieve the desired outcome without ever revealing his involvement. The city remained oblivious to the careful orchestration taking place within its streets, and the Don's control was maintained without the slightest disruption. This period also reinforced Enzo's understanding of the delicate balance between influence and invisibility. True power, he realized, lay not in overt action, but in anticipation, manipulation, and subtle orchestration. The ability to shape events without being seen, to guide decisions without force, and to remain undetected while altering outcomes was the pinnacle of mastery. Enzo had become more than an assassin, he was an architect of consequence, a strategist who moved through the city like a ghost, leaving only the inevitability of his actions as evidence. By the end of this summer, Enzo's reputation had solidified. Tales of Il Cicero spread quietly among those who had heard whispers in the right circles. He was a presence felt, not seen, a silent force capable of reshaping alliances, redirecting ambitions, and neutralizing threats with precision and subtlety. The streets of Rome had become both his classroom and his stage, teaching him that patience, foresight, and psychological insight were as vital as any weapon. And in the quiet hours, as fountains murmured softly and shadows stretched long across ancient cobblestones, Enzo walked unseen, perfecting the art of invisible influence, knowing that true mastery lay in the delicate orchestration of perception and the inevitability of consequences. The late summer in Rome settled over the city with a languid, almost hypnotic warmth, softening the edges of its ancient architecture and casting long, lazy shadows across the cobblestones. The city moved with a rhythm that seemed slow to the casual observer, but for Enzo, each movement, each sound, each flicker of light was data, a pulse of information to be interpreted, analyzed, and acted upon. He had long since become attuned to the city's subtle cues, the faintest change in a passerby's gait, a whispered conversation overheard from a distance, or the irregular rhythm of activity in a quiet piazza. Rome was no longer simply a setting for his work. It had become an extension of himself, an ecosystem that he could navigate with unmatched precision and control. During this period, Enzo faced one of the most intricate and delicate operations of his career. A rising faction within the syndicate, emboldened by minor successes and naive confidence, threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power that the Don had painstakingly maintained. These operatives were clever enough to mask their intentions, yet impulsive enough to make critical errors under subtle influence. Enzo's task was not to confront them directly, such an approach would have drawn attention and risked open conflict, but to guide their decisions, redirect their ambitions, and neutralize the threat without leaving any trace of his involvement. The challenge was monumental, demanding every ounce of observation, calculation, and psychological insight he had cultivated over years of careful practice. For weeks, Enzo observed the faction with meticulous care. He mapped their routines, memorized patterns of interaction, and identified the fissures in loyalty that could be leveraged. Every conversation, every glance, every hesitation became part of an intricate tapestry of intelligence. The city itself aided him in his craft, narrow alleyways, crowded marketplaces, and quiet courtyards provided cover for observation, while the subtle rhythms of urban life offered natural diversions for carefully orchestrated manipulations. By immersing himself in the flow of the city, Enzo ensured that his presence remained undetectable while his influence grew steadily and silently. When the moment to act arrived, Enzo executed his plan with the precision and calm of a seasoned strategist. Key documents were subtly redirected, minor operatives were nudged through misdirection, and carefully timed suggestions altered decisions in ways that seemed entirely organic to those involved. The faction, believing their choices were independent, inadvertently moved in directions that neutralized their own threat. By the time the Don received reports of the events, the balance of power had been restored, and the syndicate's interests remained secure. The operation was invisible to all but Enzo, a testament to the subtlety and mastery that had become his defining characteristic. Through these actions, Enzo refined his understanding of influence as an invisible weapon. He recognized that perception often mattered more than reality, and that control could be exercised without a single act of violence. By manipulating what people believed, he could guide decisions, provoke caution, and instill doubt. Fear and ambition became tools to shape behavior, while subtlety and patience ensured that his hand remained unseen. The city itself, its alleys, rooftops, and courtyards, became instruments in his orchestration, a landscape through which he could manipulate outcomes with almost imperceptible precision. Yet even amidst these successes, Enzo remained vigilant against the dangers inherent in his growing influence. Ambition, envy, and desperation were constants in the underworld, and any lapse in attention could jeopardize years of careful planning. He scrutinized every shadow, analyzed every gesture, and anticipated every possible deviation from expectation. Rome, with all its beauty and complexity, was also a city of hidden threats, and Enzo had learned that survival depended as much on caution and foresight as on skill and strategy. His solitude, though isolating, provided clarity and focus, allowing him to maintain an edge in an environment where mistakes could be fatal. During one particularly delicate operation, Enzo orchestrated a negotiation between two rival factions, carefully controlling information and perception to prevent conflict. Misdirected communications, strategically planted rumors, and subtle interventions guided their decisions, ensuring that tensions were resolved without violence or exposure. The factions left believing they had reached independent conclusions, unaware that every step had been influenced by the invisible hand of Il Cicero. By the time the negotiation concluded, harmony was restored, and the Don's authority remained unchallenged, a quiet testament to Enzo's strategic brilliance. As the weeks passed, Enzo's mastery over invisible influence deepened. He had learned to anticipate not only actions but reactions, not only movements but intentions. His work became less about elimination and more about orchestration, a dance of cause and effect conducted entirely from the shadows. His reputation as Il Cicero grew in the whispers of the underworld, a ghost whose influence could be felt in every decision, every hesitation, every carefully calculated step, yet who remained unseen, untouchable, and enigmatic. By the end of this late summer, Enzo had achieved a level of control and sophistication that few could rival. Rome had become both his classroom and his stage, teaching him lessons in patience, foresight, psychological acuity, and the art of invisible orchestration. The city's rhythms, its light and shadow, its movements and silences, had all become instruments in his mastery. And as night fell and the fountains murmured softly beneath the stars, Enzo walked the streets with quiet inevitability, understanding that true power was not in overt action, but in the subtle orchestration of perception, influence, and consequence. He had become a ghost, a strategist, and an architect of events whose touch was invisible but whose impact was absolute. The early days of autumn in Rome brought a subtle shift in the air, a coolness that softened the lingering heat of summer and cast the city in a golden, almost reflective light. Fountains gurgled softly in piazzas, and leaves, beginning to turn, scattered across the cobblestones in muted patterns. To most, this season signaled a gentle transition, a slowing of activity after the bustle of summer. To Enzo, however, it marked an opportunity. The city itself seemed to slow, giving him more freedom to observe, analyze, and influence the delicate interplay of power that unfolded invisibly beneath its historical veneer. Every corner, alley, and rooftop held potential for observation, every passerby a variable in the complex equation of control he had mastered over years of careful practice. During this period, Enzo's operations grew in both complexity and subtlety. His reputation as Il Cicero had reached a point where rivals moved cautiously, uncertain where his influence might strike next. Ambition and fear intertwined within the underworld, creating a network of uncertainty that Enzo could manipulate with precision. One particularly challenging situation arose when a coalition of minor operatives, emboldened by perceived opportunity, began targeting the syndicate's financial interests. These operatives were clever enough to avoid immediate detection, yet their overconfidence left gaps that Enzo could exploit. Direct confrontation was out of the question, it would have exposed the syndicate and drawn law enforcement attention, so Enzo designed a series of interventions that were indirect, subtle, and psychologically precise. For weeks, he tracked the coalition, cataloging their routines, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Every conversation, every hesitation, every minor misstep became data. Enzo observed the subtle ways they interacted, noting which members could be influenced through fear, which through ambition, and which through careful misdirection. The city itself aided him in these efforts. Narrow streets, quiet courtyards, and the hum of nighttime activity provided both cover and opportunity. He moved like a ghost through the shadows, careful not to reveal the breadth of his influence, yet shaping events with a deftness that would later seem inevitable to those affected. When the time came to act, Enzo's strategy unfolded with meticulous precision. Minor disruptions were introduced to misdirect attention, misleading information planted to sow uncertainty, and carefully timed interventions guided decisions toward outcomes favorable to the Don. The coalition, unaware of the invisible hand shaping their choices, acted in ways that ultimately neutralized their own threat. By the time the syndicate leadership became aware of the situation, it had already been resolved. Alliances were realigned, authority reaffirmed, and no one suspected that the resolution had been orchestrated entirely from the shadows. This period further reinforced Enzo's mastery over perception and influence. He realized that human behavior was often guided more by belief than by fact, and that shaping perception could be more effective than physical action. Subtlety became his most powerful tool, the quiet planting of doubt, the strategic suggestion, or a seemingly coincidental event could redirect behavior without ever requiring force. Rome, with its intricate architecture, crowded piazzas, and hidden corners, provided a perfect stage for such manipulations. The city's rhythm became a collaborator, enhancing the effectiveness of his interventions while obscuring their origin. Amid these operations, Enzo also became more attuned to the psychological nuances of fear, loyalty, and ambition. He recognized that overconfidence was as dangerous as desperation, and that subtle manipulation could provoke desired behaviors without detection. He learned to anticipate not only actions but reactions, predicting how individuals would respond to perceived slights, opportunities, or threats. In this way, he could orchestrate entire scenarios in which the desired outcome was virtually inevitable, yet appeared entirely natural to those involved. One operation in particular highlighted his growing sophistication. A minor operative had stumbled upon sensitive information and threatened, albeit unknowingly, to compromise the Don's interests. Enzo's approach was not to eliminate the threat but to redirect it. Through a series of carefully designed events, misdirected communications, planted suggestions, and subtle interventions, he guided the operative's choices, ensuring that the information was contained and the threat neutralized. The operative believed their actions were autonomous, yet in reality, Enzo's influence had quietly steered every step. By morning, the danger was resolved, invisible to all but the strategist behind it. Enzo's growing mastery extended beyond the immediate operations of the syndicate. He began observing the broader interplay of rival factions, monitoring ambitions, vulnerabilities, and alliances. By predicting shifts in loyalty, identifying potential betrayals, and subtly influencing perceptions, he could preempt threats before they materialized. Rome, with its labyrinthine streets, ancient buildings, and hidden courtyards, provided both a laboratory and a theater for these maneuvers. Every operation reinforced the principle that influence, invisibility, and patience were more powerful than any weapon. By the end of this early autumn period, Enzo had solidified his reputation as an unparalleled strategist and manipulator. His legend as Il Cicero was no longer confined to whispers, it was a tangible presence that shaped behavior across the underworld. Men moved cautiously, doubting their own choices, aware that the invisible hand of the ghostly assassin might be guiding their steps. Enzo himself remained solitary, ever vigilant, and ever precise, understanding that his power lay not in what was seen, but in what could be orchestrated from the shadows. The city had become a silent partner in his work, teaching lessons in patience, foresight, and psychological mastery, and in these quiet months, Enzo's influence became absolute, unseen but undeniable. The deepening autumn in Rome brought with it a crispness that hung in the air, mingling with the fading warmth of summer to create long, quiet evenings. The city, layered with centuries of history, seemed to settle into a slower, more contemplative rhythm. Fountains whispered in empty piazzas, and the soft murmur of footsteps echoed faintly along the cobblestones. To the casual observer, the city appeared serene, almost suspended in time. But for Enzo, it was alive with currents of intention, ambition, and subtle danger. Every alley, staircase, and rooftop was a thread in an intricate web of observation and influence that he had woven over years. He could feel the pulse of the streets beneath his feet, anticipate the shifts of human behavior, and orchestrate outcomes with precision. During this period, Enzo encountered a challenge that required his most delicate and patient work yet. A coalition of minor operatives, emboldened by small successes and overconfidence, began probing the boundaries of the syndicate's influence. Their actions were indirect, a delayed shipment here, a misdirected communication there, yet cumulatively, they posed a serious threat. Any direct confrontation would have risked exposure, drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement and rival factions alike. Enzo recognized that subtlety, anticipation, and psychological insight were paramount. He began by observing, cataloging the routines, habits, and vulnerabilities of each member, understanding not just what they did, but why they did it, and how they might respond to carefully engineered stimuli. Weeks of observation yielded a detailed map of the coalition's operations. Enzo noted the cracks in their alliances, the tensions simmering beneath seemingly polite interactions, and the overconfidence that often led to minor but telling mistakes. Rome itself served as both backdrop and tool, its narrow alleyways, quiet courtyards, and crowded piazzas provided cover for surveillance and opportunities for influence. By moving through the city like a ghost, Enzo ensured that his presence remained undetectable while his manipulations subtly reshaped the landscape of power. When the time came to intervene, Enzo executed his plan with the precision of a master strategist. Minor actions, a misdirected message, a carefully placed rumor, a seemingly coincidental encounter, guided the operative's decisions in ways that neutralized the threat without any overt confrontation. The coalition, believing their choices were autonomous, inadvertently acted in alignment with Enzo's intentions. By the time the Dawn was informed, the situation had resolved itself, alliances were realigned, and the syndicate's control remained unchallenged. The operation was a testament to the power of subtle orchestration, reinforcing the idea that true mastery lay not in force but in influence and perception. This period also deepened Enzo's understanding of human psychology. He recognized that ambition, fear, loyalty, and pride could be anticipated and gently nudged to achieve desired outcomes. The careful manipulation of perception often produced results far more effective than direct action. By shaping beliefs and expectations, he could guide choices before they were made, making the improbable seem inevitable. Rome, with its ancient streets and hidden corners, became a laboratory for these techniques, a living theater where each operation honed his skills further. One particularly delicate episode involved an operative who had inadvertently discovered information that could jeopardize the syndicate's financial interests. Enzo could have eliminated the threat with a single action, but he chose instead to redirect it. Through a combination of misdirected communications, subtle suggestions, and orchestrated coincidences, he guided the operative's actions, ensuring that the sensitive information was contained without anyone realizing his hand in the outcome. The result was seamless, the threat was neutralized, the operative believed in the independence of their actions, and the Dawn's authority remained unchallenged. As his operations grew increasingly sophisticated, Enzo also began to anticipate the long-term implications of his interventions. He understood that every action, even the most subtle, could ripple through the underworld, influencing alliances, rivalries, and perceptions for months or even years. He refined his methods to ensure that each manipulation was not only effective in the immediate moment but also reinforced future stability and control. By thinking several moves ahead, he maintained a level of strategic advantage that few could imagine, let alone counter. During this period, Enzo also became increasingly aware of the symbolic power of his presence, or rather, his absence. The legend of Il Cicero spread quietly but effectively through whispers and rumors. Men in the underworld moved with caution, aware of an invisible force that could influence events with subtlety, precision, and inevitability. Even without appearing, Enzo's reputation guided behavior, shaped decisions, and reinforced the Dawn's authority. Fear, respect, and uncertainty became tools as potent as any weapon. By the end of autumn, Enzo had achieved a mastery of influence that transcended the physical aspects of his work. He was no longer merely an executor of orders or a silent observer, he had become a strategist, a manipulator, and an invisible arbiter whose touch shaped the underworld without ever being traced. Rome had taught him that power resided not in action alone, but in anticipation, perception, and subtle orchestration. In the quiet hours, as the city's fountains murmured and shadows stretched long across ancient stones, Enzo moved unseen, a ghost of inevitability whose influence was absolute, precise, and entirely undetectable. The early winter in Rome brought a crispness to the air that seemed to heighten the city's textures, making every stone, shadow, and flicker of movement more pronounced. The fading light of the afternoon stretched long across piazzas, casting shadows that pooled in quiet corners where secrets could be whispered and plans could unfold unnoticed. For most, the season carried a sense of stillness and reflection, but for Enzo, it was a period of heightened vigilance and careful orchestration. The city, layered with centuries of history and intrigue, had become an extension of his mind, every alley, stairway, and courtyard part of a complex network through which he could observe, anticipate, and influence. He moved with the ease of someone entirely at home in both the light and the shadows, sensing the rhythm of the streets as though they were part of his own body. During this period, Enzo faced a particularly precarious challenge. A rival faction, previously underestimated, had begun making subtle moves to expand its influence within territories under the syndicate's control. Their approach was cautious and indirect: strategic miscommunications, delayed shipments, and minor sabotage. To counter them directly would risk exposure, potentially drawing law enforcement attention or sparking conflict that could destabilize the delicate balance of power. Enzo recognized that brute force was not an option. Subtlety, psychological insight, and strategic orchestration were essential. He began by studying the faction meticulously, observing interactions, noting habits, and identifying the weak points that could be leveraged. Weeks of careful surveillance revealed the faction's vulnerabilities. Enzo mapped their operations, noting where loyalty faltered, where ambition outweighed caution, and where small interventions could yield maximum effect. He watched as minor missteps created opportunities, and he waited patiently, understanding that the timing of his actions would be as crucial as their execution. Rome itself became both a partner and a tool. Its labyrinthine streets, quiet courtyards, and bustling markets offered natural cover for observation, and the rhythms of daily life provided perfect camouflage for his subtle manipulations. When the moment arrived, Enzo acted with the quiet precision that had become his signature. Misdirected communications, planted rumors, and carefully orchestrated coincidences guided the faction's choices in ways that neutralized their threat without any overt confrontation. The operatives believed they were acting independently, yet each decision had been subtly influenced by Enzo's unseen hand. By the time the Don received word of the situation, the threat had been resolved, alliances had been stabilized, and the syndicate's control remained unchallenged. The operation was invisible, effective, and a testament to the power of influence over force. During this period, Enzo's understanding of human psychology deepened even further. He recognized that perception could be shaped with as much precision as any action. Fear, desire, loyalty, and ambition were all tools to be guided. Subtle suggestions, misperceptions, and timing could redirect choices before they were consciously made. Rome, with its history, architecture, and complex social networks, became a living laboratory where every street, shadow, and whisper could be leveraged to achieve his objectives. His interventions were invisible, yet their consequences were felt by all who moved within the underworld. A particularly delicate operation involved an operative who had come dangerously close to exposing sensitive information to a rival faction. Enzo's solution was not elimination but redirection. Through misdirected messages, subtle insinuations, and a series of coincidences carefully staged, he guided the operative's actions so that the information was contained and the potential threat neutralized. The operative believed in the autonomy of their choices, entirely unaware of the orchestrator guiding every step. By the end of the operation, the syndicate's interests were preserved, and the Don's authority remained firmly intact. Enzo also began to see the broader implications of his influence during this period. Each subtle intervention, each carefully guided perception, created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate outcome. Alliances shifted, ambitions were redirected, and behaviors were subtly molded to reinforce stability and control. By thinking several steps ahead, Enzo could ensure that the consequences of his actions would continue to benefit the syndicate long after the immediate situation had resolved. In this way, he became not just a tactician but a long-term strategist, orchestrating the flow of the underworld like a conductor guiding an unseen symphony. His legend as Il Cicero grew quietly but powerfully during these months. Rivals, even those who had never seen him, moved with caution, aware that the unseen hand could alter outcomes at any moment. Allies came to trust the invisible influence that protected their interests, and the Don increasingly relied on his insight and orchestration. Enzo's mastery of subtlety, patience, and psychological influence had reached a level where he no longer needed to intervene directly to exert control. The fear and respect his reputation inspired guided behavior in his favor. By the time the first snows dusted the rooftops of Rome, Enzo had achieved a near-complete command over the invisible dynamics of the city's underworld. He had become more than an assassin, he was a strategist, a manipulator, and an architect of consequences, whose touch was imperceptible yet absolute. Every street, every shadow, and every interaction was a potential instrument in his orchestration. Rome had become both mentor and stage, teaching lessons in patience, foresight, and the power of perception. And as night fell over the city, with fountains murmuring softly and lamplight reflecting off ancient stones, Enzo moved unseen through the streets, a ghost of inevitability whose influence shaped the underworld without ever revealing the hand behind it. The deep winter in Rome settled over the city like a soft, silver veil, transforming familiar streets and piazzas into a landscape of quiet contemplation. The air was crisp, carrying a subtle sharpness that seemed to heighten every sound, the distant tolling of church bells, the faint echo of footsteps on frost-covered cobblestones, and the whisper of wind through narrow alleyways. To most, the season brought stillness and reflection, a time to retreat indoors and conserve energy. To Enzo, however, the city had never been more alive. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, and every subtle shift in human behavior was data to be observed, interpreted, and, when necessary, guided. Rome, in its layered complexity of light, history, and hidden corners, had become an extension of his mind, a living organism whose rhythms he could anticipate and influence with the precision of a master strategist. During this period, Enzo faced a challenge that tested the full extent of his patience and ingenuity. A rival faction, emboldened by perceived weaknesses within the syndicate, had begun to maneuver subtly, seeking to exploit gaps in control and influence. Their actions were indirect, minor disruptions, miscommunications, and covert maneuvers that, while not overtly threatening, carried the potential to destabilize carefully maintained alliances. Direct confrontation would have been disastrous, attracting law enforcement attention, provoking unnecessary conflict, and threatening the Don's carefully cultivated authority. Enzo knew that a subtle, multi-layered strategy was the only solution. He began by meticulously mapping the faction's behavior. Every interaction, every hesitation, every trace of misjudgment was catalogued. He observed how individuals reacted to perceived slights, opportunities, or threats, identifying those whose ambition could be influenced and those whose fear could be leveraged. The city itself became a collaborator in his strategy. Narrow alleyways, deserted courtyards, and the natural rhythms of urban life provided cover for observation, while the flow of the city offered opportunities to stage interventions without detection. Enzo's movements were imperceptible, yet his influence began to ripple through the underworld, subtle and inevitable. When the time to act arrived, Enzo executed a plan of extraordinary finesse. Misdirected information, planted suggestions, and carefully staged coincidences guided the rival faction's decisions, steering them into actions that neutralized their own threat. Every move appeared natural, autonomous, and unforced to those involved, yet the outcome aligned perfectly with the Don's interests. By the time the leadership of the syndicate was apprised of the situation, the threat had been neutralized, alliances reinforced, and the balance of power restored. The operation, invisible and meticulously controlled, became a testament to the power of subtle orchestration over overt force. Throughout this period, Enzo refined his mastery of human psychology. He understood that perception was often more influential than reality, that guiding belief could be as decisive as direct intervention. Fear, ambition, loyalty, and pride became instruments through which he shaped outcomes with precision. Subtle hints, misperceptions, and the strategic timing of events allowed him to redirect decisions, manipulate behavior, and orchestrate scenarios where the desired outcome seemed inevitable. Rome, with its layered streets, hidden courtyards, and bustling marketplaces, provided both a laboratory and a theater in which his skills could reach their full potential. One particularly intricate episode involved an operative who had inadvertently acquired information that could compromise the syndicate's financial and strategic interests. Rather than resorting to elimination, Enzo carefully guided the operative's decisions through a combination of misdirected communications, whispered suggestions, and coincidental events. Each step was designed to neutralize the threat without revealing the intervention. By the end of the operation, the sensitive information was contained, the operative believed their actions to be independent, and the Don's authority remained intact. This seamless orchestration reinforced Enzo's principle that subtlety and patience were far more effective than force. As the weeks passed, Enzo's influence extended beyond immediate operations. He began to anticipate the long-term implications of every intervention, understanding how a single subtle act could ripple through the underworld, affecting alliances, shaping rivalries, and molding behavior months or even years into the future. This foresight elevated him from a mere executor of orders to a strategic architect whose presence, though unseen, defined the trajectory of the syndicate's influence. Rome, with its intricate streets, hidden vantage points, and dynamic social networks, had become both classroom and stage for this mastery. During this period, Enzo also became increasingly aware of the symbolic power of his absence. The whispers of Il Cicero, the assassin who could strike or influence events without being seen, had grown into a tangible presence across the city. Men moved cautiously, knowing that an invisible hand could shape outcomes at any moment. Allies trusted the quiet guidance that protected their interests, and even rivals adjusted their plans in subtle deference to a force they could neither see nor confront. His reputation became a tool as potent as any weapon, shaping the behavior of those around him without a single overt act. By the end of this deep winter period, Enzo had achieved a level of strategic and psychological mastery that few could rival. He was no longer simply an assassin or enforcer, he had become a master of influence, perception, and long-term orchestration. Every alley, courtyard, and street of Rome was mapped in his mind, every human interaction anticipated, and every potential threat neutralized before it could materialize. He had transformed the very fabric of the underworld, not with violence alone, but through patience, foresight, and the delicate orchestration of perception. As the city slept beneath the soft glow of lanterns and the hush of falling snow, Enzo moved unseen, a ghostly presence whose influence was absolute, precise, and entirely undetectable, shaping the course of Rome's criminal underworld with the inevitability of fate itself. The late winter in Rome was quiet and still, with the city's ancient stones bathed in soft lamplight and the faint echo of footsteps drifting through empty streets. Enzo moved like a shadow, unseen yet profoundly influential, orchestrating events with subtle precision. His legend as Il Cicero had reached every corner of the underworld, rivals acted cautiously, allies trusted the invisible guidance protecting their interests, and the Don's authority remained unchallenged. By this point, Enzo's mastery over perception and influence was complete. He had neutralized threats without violence, guided decisions without detection, and shaped the flow of the syndicate's power through careful orchestration. Rome itself had become a partner in his work, its alleys, courtyards, and bustling streets serving as instruments in his strategies. Every subtle intervention, every whispered suggestion, and every coincidental seeming event reinforced his control, creating a network of invisible influence that ensured stability and dominance. As the city settled into the long nights of late winter, Enzo walked its streets with quiet inevitability. He was no longer simply an assassin or strategist, he was a master of unseen forces, a ghost whose impact was absolute. The underworld moved according to the rhythm he had designed, a silent testament to patience, precision, and the enduring power of subtle, invisible influence.